All right. Hello. Thanks for joining, everyone. I'm super happy to be here together with Larry today. We're going to talk about property hooks. And Larry, I'm so excited that I think actually today was the last day of voting for the property hooks RFC.
Yesterday.
And yesterday, so that means it's a done deal and it's getting added in PHP. That's a great achievement. We're going to talk about property hooks today. We're going to talk about PHP RFCs in general because I think you have a couple of things to say about that as well. But first of all, just to make sure that everyone's up to speed with who you are, in case there are any people who don't know who you are, I wanted to start out with you just introducing yourself a little bit. What are you doing? How are you involved in the PHP community? What should we know you from? And I'm gonna just give you the
Mhm.
stage here for a minute.
Hello, world. Larry Garfield, Krell on most social media. I've been writing PHP now for 25 years. When I started, PHP 3 was still the new and cool kid on the block,
Right.
if that gives you a sense of how old I am. um, let's see, most people probably would first have heard of me in the Go PHP 5 project
Okay.
back in 2007, where at the time, everyone was still using PHP 4 and the hosts were still using PHP 4, so no one could upgrade to PHP 5. And I coordinated a bunch of projects and hosts to get together and say, all right, we're all switching to 5.2 at the same time, deal. And we assassinated PHP 4.
Mm,
And that was
nice.
one of those forgotten major moments in PHP history where it could have gone very badly,
Hmm.
but didn't. Spent 10 years as a Drupal developer. I worked
Okay.
at an agency and also was one of the core leads for quite a while and led the charge to modernize the code base with uh, Drupal 8.
Mm.
Um, then worked in developer relations for about 5 years for Platform SH, which is a very good hosting company. I still support them.
Nice.
Worked briefly for Typo 3, the German CMS.
Right. Okay.
And now I'm a staff engineer at LegalZoom, where I was doing PHP and now I'm doing more Kotlin than anything else. So go figure.
Interesting. How like do you like Kotlin over PHP or
Kotlin has some nice features in it, and we'll talk about that. Like, the property hooks RFC is very
mm,
similar to what Kotlin has. We'll get into that in a bit.
mm.
Um, it's fine as a language. I really don't like the Java ecosystem, but Kotlin itself is perfectly fine as a language. I'm liking it.
Nice. Nice. Um, yeah, Larry, we want to talk about for a big part in this stream about the property hooks, of course, because it's the big thing out there now. I personally am so excited about it, and lots of people are. Um, we there's a lot to talk about. Maybe we
Yeah.
should start by explaining what property hooks are in a nutshell. There's a lot to say about them. I think you made like the biggest RFC in PHP history or close to it, so there is a lot to say
Close
about
to.
it. How would you like summarize property hooks in just one or two sentences, if you're even able to do that?
So there's a couple of ways one can look at property hooks. I think the simplest way to look at them is we already have the magic get and set methods.
Mm-hmm.
You can now do that on an individual property basis rather than this big global catch-all.
Yeah.
And that lets you do a lot more robust things with it, um, without having all the extra mess of dealing with the get and set magic methods.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest use case for hooks actually is not using them
Right.
because, as we explained in the RFC, it is extremely common these days to have data objects or entities or so on that have what I call the bean pattern taken from
Mm-hmm.
Java, where you have a property named foo, and then you have a get foo method that just returns foo, and then a set foo method that just sets foo, and they do absolutely nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
But they're
Mm-hmm.
there just in case you might want to put some logic in there eventually.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we have to make it a private property and add all these methods rather than just having a public property and skipping all
Mm-hmm.
the extra boilerplate.
All right.
With hooks, you can now just make it a public property and you can read and write to it. And in the 1 in 10 case
Yeah.
that you actually do need to add a little bit of extra validation, or put an access check around the get routine, or whatever, you can just slot that in on the property itself, and it's not an API change anymore.
Right.
So
Let me
the advantage of hooks, there's two ways to look at hooks. The big one is as an excuse to not have to write so much boilerplate getter and setter methods. So, if the hook simply existing results in there being about 100,000 lines less code in the world, probably more like 10 million lines less code in the world, and no one ever uses them, that's still a huge win for PHP. Now, I hope people do use them for more than that, but just their existence eliminates the need for a lot of boilerplate.
Right. Yeah, let me actually show the RFC real quickly here, so that people who aren't aware of property hooks yet get a little bit of a feeling of what they are about. This is like one of the most basic examples in the RFC. Like I said, it's a very long RFC, very thorough. So this is set hook here, where you can add some extra logic here to make sure that your business rules are enforced. Let me search for a get hook somewhere, like over here. Full name property that has. This is interesting, right? The get actually is just. I'm a Laravel developer, so I'm used to like accessors and mutators, like that terminology. But this is a calculated property of some sort. You have a setter as well that takes a full name, I guess, here, and then first and
it takes first a full name and it splits it back out. So this example is saying internally we store a first name and a last name as separate values.
Yeah.
Externally we create a virtual property called full name, so you can write a full name to it and it'll chop it up, and when you read it you get back the combined first name and last name. This is a contrived example. Not everyone's name is just first and last, obviously, but we just needed a simple example for the RFC. But yeah, virtual properties are one of the things you can do with hooks that are in the second camp, which is, okay, now that we've got these, where can we use them where they'll actually make data modeling a lot more robust? And that's something that a lot of the RFCs that Ilya and I have worked on try to emphasize, is improving our data modeling capabilities.
Right. Yeah, because you mentioned Ilya here. This RFC is a joint effort, I could say. You and Ilya are working or have worked together on it. And it has produced a very nice result here. The concept itself, it's probably familiar to many PHP developers. I already mentioned Laravel with accessors and mutators. I believe Symfony or Doctrine, it has the same kind of pattern. I'm not sure. Actually,
Doctrine usually has the separate get and set methods.
Okay.
So in a lot of ways, it's if every Doctrine entity in the world loses 2/3 of its code because it's now useless boilerplate, win, then that's success.
Yes.
And then we can also do more exciting things like this if we want to.
Yeah, it's so nice. And one of the things that I'm so excited about, like the coolest thing of this RFC is that there's also support for interfaces.
Yes.
And well, let me search for
scroll down a little right here.
interface. You can define properties with their get and or set hooks in interfaces, and this has such a huge impact on, at least for me, the code that I write. You can't imagine how many getters and setters I have to define on interfaces, because I like to program to an interface instead of concrete implementations, and I have to add so much boilerplate while all I want is actually just be able to access the property, the public property. It's probably read-only in most cases, and that's it. And it's gonna get so much better with this RFC.
Absolutely. And very often they're things like they're a Boolean flag of some kind on an object, or they are a count property, or some other, what is a logical property about this object rather than a physical property.
Right.
And hooks, there are properties in interfaces, lets you say, hey, this interface needs to have this introspection capability on it. And I need to be able to ask for the first name field, or the is processed field, or whatever. And instead of that needing to be a public read-only property, so I can only edit it once, or being a public mutable properties where I can't trust that people won't mess with it, I can now make it a virtual property, compute
Yeah.
it on the fly,
Yeah.
and people can't modify it, but I can still work with it like it's
Right.
a property. Which also means that in the 99% case,
Mm-hmm.
when all it's doing is returning some internal property anyway,
Mm-hmm.
I can just make it a public property and
Right.
move on with life.
Yeah.
Until that case when I actually need to do some more interesting logic with it.
Right. That's what you mean when you say that the goal of this RFC is for it to be not used in most cases, and just for people to start using properties. And if they need exceptions to the default way, they can add hooks if they want to.
Exactly.
And it's a non-breaking way to do that. So
I think one of the, at a core level, what this achieves is it separates logical properties from physical properties. So until now, if you have a property on an object, that can either be completely hidden or fully exposed. And now,
Right.
if you're exposing it, oh great, you're exposing implementation details.
Yeah.
Now we can have properties from a logical sense that don't necessarily correspond to a physical property, and vice versa. And in the common case where they do line up, cool. In the cases where they don't have to.
Yeah.
We can do something more interesting with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and let me know if you agree or not, Larry, but I would say that this RFC, this new feature to PHP, it's probably the biggest thing to happen to PHP, since I would say enums and attributes, type properties, it's like that magnitude of feature for PHP.
I would agree.
Yeah.
The PHP goes through periods where we'll have a couple of versions that do a lot, and then a couple of versions that don't do much, and a couple of versions that do a lot. 8.0 or 7.4, 8.0, and 8.1 did a lot. And there's a lot of cool new stuff in those releases.
Yeah.
8.2 and 8.3 were kind of more boring. This is the first big, now I definitely need to upgrade feature that we've had, I think, since enums. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's my feeling as well. Yeah, I try to follow all releases pretty closely, and exactly like 8.2 and 8.3, they were fine. It felt like more maintenance releases and just fine tuning. And this is like such a beefy new feature, and it's gonna be great. For me at least, it's gonna have a huge impact. I don't know if you know this, Larry. On this YouTube channel, I often live stream making like this little framework from scratch, and people interact with me, and it's just a fun project. And I will have to rewrite probably all interfaces now because of property hooks, and I'm so happy about that. It's gonna be a lot of work, but it's gonna be great.
In some of my own libraries, I have a bunch of methods on an interface where 99.9% of the implementations are returning a hard-coded string. That's all they do.
Yeah.
And though it's a perfect case where, like, okay, I don't actually need this to be a method. I'll just make it a property. 99% of the time, I just return, set the property to a string and move on with life.
Yeah.
And if I need something more, I can put a get hook on it and do more interesting logic.
Yeah.
So I would love to convert some of those libraries over to that when I can.
Nice. Hey, I wonder, before maybe diving into some more property hook stuff, you worked with Ilya on this RFC. It's been quite a process, if I'm not mistaken. This has taken a really long time to get at this point. And it shows because, like, the RFC, it won by a landslide. 24 people voted yes, only 2 voted no.
42 to 2.
Yeah. That's English numbers for me. I'm sorry. 42 people voted yes, and only 2 people voted no. So that's great. That's just mind blowing, actually, for for this kind of RFC. How was it to work on this kind of feature together with Ilya, and just in general the RFC process for PHP?
Oh boy! So I enjoy doing language design. Right. So working through the details of how do we do this sort of thing is fun for me.
Okay.
Figuring out, okay, what change can we make that has the biggest impacts? How can we do that in a way that's going to be most forward compatible and compatible with other features? I enjoy that. That's fun. I don't do the actual C implementation for the patch. Ilya does all of that when we're collaborating. because he knows how the engine works, and my attempts to work on PHP itself have all ended in me feeling like a total moron. So I don't do that anymore.
Okay.
It's a beast of a code base.
Hmm.
That said, the RFC process itself,
Mhm.
and PHP's governance on that is as messy as the code base. Let's
That's
start
a
there.
nice way of putting it. Yeah.
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 It's a lot of, in the US, we would call it spec work or
Okay.
speculative work. It's a term from the design community where you're doing a ton of work up front with no guarantee that any of it actually gets used or you get any payment for it. Now, obviously,
Right.
in this case, I'm not getting paid. Ilya is paid by the foundation,
Right.
which is fantastic.
Mhm.
But we didn't know until we opened the vote if this was going to pass unanimously, fail unanimously, pass barely, almost pass. We had absolutely no idea. So we were both
Right.
putting in hundreds of hours over the last 2 years.
Right, because you've been working 2 years on this.
Yeah,
Wow, that's a really long time.
and actually Nikita Popov had an RFC a few years back that was similar to this. It also included asymmetric visibility, but it did not go into anywhere near as much detail and flesh out the corner cases as we did. So the concept of this in PHP is like 4 or 5 years old.
Right. Yeah.
But after enums, Ilya decided he wanted to work on this stuff.
Okay.
I'm like, cool, I'll join you.
Yeah, because you work together with Ilya on enums as well, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That was the work
Same
of both
process.
of you. Cool.
And so, all right, we originally started with the asymmetric visibility and what every other language calls accessors, and we're calling hooks, and that's my fault. I apologize. We'll get into that. And then decided people don't like big RFCs, so let's split these two features in half because they actually are different. Syntactically, in C# specifically, they get smushed together. That's honestly a mistake in my mind. Kotlin and Swift don't do that syntactically. And because of some of the quirks of PHP, that style of syntax wouldn't work as well. So we tried asymmetric visibility first, figuring that'd be the easy one. We actually did the design for both of the RFCs first, then implemented just the asymmetric visibility because we wanted to make sure that they were compatible with each other.
Right.
I like long-term planning. And
by the way, such a weird thing for PHP contributors, long-term
planning.
Yeah,
I know. It's
okay.
So in like first quarter of 2023, I think something like that, we put forward asymmetric visibility RFC, which ended up not passing, which was very disappointing given how much work we put into it.
Yeah.
In part because a lot of it was people bike shedding. People fussy about specific syntax decisions, even though we had, done everything we could to come up with a consensus view. And after that, we pivoted and went, all right, let's see if we can get hooks in. Got that part of the way, got close to the end of the development period for 8.3.
Right.
And decided we're close enough to the border. Let's just hold off and do it in 8.4. And
that's I would say that's actually a smart decision to be able to just postpone to be sure that it's really solid, even though you might be very enthusiastic about it at that moment and just want to publish it. It's something I would probably do, but
there were some things where Ilya wasn't quite sure about some implementation details. He wanted to be absolutely certain about them first. So in the end, we sat on it for a while, and there was also a lot of, is this going to be worth it? We don't know if it could have a chance of passing. Do we want to put even more work into it if it ends up coming to nothing? And that was a stressor for us for the past year. And that's just baked into the RFC process as it is right now, that you don't get concrete feedback on how well something will be received until the actual vote, after you've done all of the actual work. So that's part of the problem. Then we brought it back early this year, And we have made a few changes along the way between last year's version and this year's version, and then made some more changes in response to the discussion, which at least one person has told me some of those changes are why they voted yes. So it was useful.
Okay. Yeah.
And then, call the vote and put it out.
Wow. Yeah. I don't think like many userland developers realize how much work goes into these things. And I didn't realize, well, I kind of knew, but now that you mention it, it becomes more clear that you take a huge gamble on every RFC when it comes to time investment, because who knows whether it will succeed or not. I mean, you and I, we talked about this briefly when the vote started, like about how surprised we were that it was doing so well. No one expected it to be like this.
Yeah, I mean, the only feedback you get. So one of the issues is the people who can vote on RFC. There's about 1,500 of them. Only about 100 have done so in the last 2 years.
Like,
but it's not always the same people.
1,500.
1,500
people who can vote. Who can vote?
Yes.
Wow.
We'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's who is actually going to vote. We don't even know until it happens. There's some people who I thought would be against it who ended up not voting when I expected them to vote no, and I didn't expect that.
Okay.
And when we're getting feedback on the mailing list, as authors, we have no idea, is this person the only person in the world who has this opinion of whatever feature, or do they represent the consensus opinion of everyone on the list, or are they the consensus opinion of people who have a vote, but people who don't vote, who aren't internal contributors, feel very differently? Is there a difference between those two groups?
Right.
Someone's responding on the list. Are we talking to someone who has a vote or not?
Yeah.
None of that is apparent to anyone. So, we could absolutely have an RFC where 5 people respond on the mailing list, all of them positive, and then it fails, 30 to 5. That is absolutely possible right now, and I think it's happened. And that's stressful for all involved, not just the authors, but also for reviewers of RFCs.
Definitely. Yeah, and I can't help but feel that it eventually leads to people holding back and just not want to give their 100%, because it's such like you don't know, and probably like so many people are doing this on a voluntary basis, you as well, with this RFC here. It's a huge, you already need like a huge passion for an open source project to be willing to invest this amount of time wow. I didn't realize it was this extreme, actually. I try to follow externals internals via externals, but not too closely anymore, because there's just too much other things going on. So yeah, this is mind-opening to me. By the way, before we continue here, I want to remind people in the chat that you can ask questions as well for Larry, and we'll take our time to go through them as well at one point during the stream. I think we want to linger a bit more on property hooks still, because like you mentioned, there were a lot of interesting things to discuss about them as well. Anything like specifically? I already forgot. Like when we were talking 5 minutes ago. Do you remember?
5 minutes ago, I don't know. So I think, I mentioned before, there's 2 ways to look at property hooks. One is as a thing that you don't use except in rare cases, so that you just need less boilerplate. And if that's how people use hooks, fantastic, that's a win. The other way to think about it is the separating physical from logical. And so you can now do things like have properties that have built-in validation. Have properties that have built-in like case normalizing of value. You can actually have a write-only property.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can only think of one possible use case for that,
Yeah.
but it technically still works.
And what's
So
the use case?
if you want to write, say, a password to a property, and you want the write process to hash it and store the hash
Gotcha.
only
Yeah.
on an internal property.
Yeah.
And then you can't read the original one back out, but you're only storing the hashed version, but you can
Gotcha.
write an unhashed version to it.
Right.
So that's the only use case I can think of for a write-only property, but it's there.
Yeah.
So you can now have automatically lazily cached properties. That's very easy to do now. It's one line of code.
Right.
That's you could have done using methods, but this is just so much easier.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like, I'm a big fan of structural design.
Yeah.
I want the type system to do my job for me. I want the type system to dictate how my code looks, because if the type system and the structure of the code are strict enough, then I don't need to worry about all these edge cases. Just the simple example, is this parameter I've just passed a user name string or a user object? By typing the property or typing the parameter, I know, and I need zero error handling now. I know exactly what I'm going to get. And my static analysis tools will tell me if I'm wrong. And there's lots of code, just error handling code just disappears at that point.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
the
what I like.
The more of that you can do, the more robust your code gets. And that's why enums are the same concept. Let's define the problem in such a way that we don't need code to solve it. We just need the definition. Property hooks are another aspect of that. Asymmetric visibility is another aspect of that. A lot of the RFCs that Ilya and I have been working on are based around that concept of, design the code rather than write the code. And that makes your life easier in the long run. And so property hooks are just another tool in that toolbox to have to write less code in the end.
Yeah. I have like the same vision on using the type system as well. So this is just gonna be great. A couple of questions here about property hooks, particularly. Do these hooks work on static properties as well? I haven't read the full RFC.
They do not.
They do not. Okay.
Yeah, static properties are kind of weird in the engine. They work differently than normal properties, and trying to support both would have been like 50% more work. And the kind of things you're going to use static properties for, I don't think these are even necessary. So no static properties.
Okay.
In theory, one could probably add them later if we have a reason to, but I don't think we have a reason to.
Another question here. Could you please describe the performance impact, or are there cases when it's better to avoid property hooks?
So as I understand it from talking to Ilya, accessing a raw property is the fastest.
Yeah.
The next fastest is calling a method. The next fastest is a property that has a hook on it. And the slowest is the existing get and set magic methods.
Right. Yeah.
So I would not put hooks on every property if they're on the hot path, because they will be a bit slower than just a raw property access, because the engine is doing more work.
Yeah, makes sense.
That said, if you just make a bunch of properties public that you can do that now, that's actually going to save you runtime. So
exactly.
And then on this rare case that you need to add a hook, okay, you can just eat that time. So on balance, I think it'll be about a wash, if not a slight improvement. But definitely don't have lots and lots and lots of get hooks on your hot path.
Yeah.
That could have a performance impact. That said, if I can be a little bit snarky, if you're using Laravel, you're already used to the magic get and set being called 14 million times. So if you're using Eloquent, you already don't care about performance.
Oh, shots fired here. Let's move to the next question. No, but you're absolutely right. A follow-up here. Can we enforce class constants through interfaces using the get hook? I would suppose no. because
Um,
constants aren't properties.
oh, yeah, that's interfaces already support constants,
Oh yeah,
and nothing in the hooks really changes that.
yeah,
Hooks are all about object properties. If it's not an object property, then hooks don't really have anything to do with it.
yeah. Okay. Um, let's check here. A couple more questions about property hooks. What do you think about that you need to repeat logic for similar behavior in every property setter getter? Would that be a better job for attributes and reflection?
So that's an interesting question.
Mhm.
It depends on what behavior you're talking about.
Mhm.
Hooks and attributes solve two different problems.
Mhm.
Both of them are very useful. I love attributes. I have an
Mhm.
attribute parsing library that's everyone should be using.
What's
I
it
mean,
called?
that's attribute utils, krell slash
I
attribute utils.
I need that. Okay, I'm gonna.
Yeah, it's we can talk
Convert
about that
that.
another time, but it's
Yeah.
a wrapper library around attributes that makes them super powerful. I love
Okay.
them.
Yeah.
But they solve a different problem than hooks do.
Mhm.
If you want to repeat similar behavior, there's a hook can call a method inside of an object. So if your entire hook body is, hey, call this private method in the object,
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
call that private method from 16 different properties if you want to. That's fine.
Right. Oh yeah.
Swift, which has a similar functionality, has a feature that I don't remember the name of, and honestly, I couldn't understand the syntax of when I was looking at their documentation. But essentially, it's, as I understand it, it's like traits, but for properties.
Mm. Mm.
We did not include that in this RFC because it was big enough as is, and we're not entirely sure how useful that will be. But in concept, if we find that's a real need, then in the future we can look into stealing stuff from Swift to have essentially traits for properties. I don't know what that would look like at this point. We didn't get into that.
Yeah.
But long term, that's a possibility.
Yeah. As a side note, by the way, this is one of your blog posts, Larry. This
Oh
is
wow, this is old.
yeah,
Yeah.
but everyone should read this post. I'm serious. This has been such an eye opener for how I write code. So because we're talking about traits here, and it kind of links to this post. I'll, if I remember, I'll well, I can paste a link here in chat.
It'll
Bookmark
be in the
this.
show notes or whatever they say.
Yeah, well, if I remember, that's just a side note. I was reminded about it when you talked about traits. So okay,
Yeah.
for in with regards to property hooks, could be some improvements in the future. We'll see how it goes. Are you up for a couple more questions about?
I love doing Q&A, so go for it.
Okay, cool. Because this is more about RFCs, like going a bit broader than property hooks here. So great to see your PHP contribution is definitely a game changer. The question is, I know you had several RFCs in a list, partial functions, etc. Any chance to have them active again? There are a couple
boy.
more. Yeah.
So, despite the fact that I now have my name on two major RFCs, my actual success rate for RFCs is about 2 out of 11 right now, something like that. I've collaborated with a number of different people on various proposals, most of which have not passed, unfortunately. All of which are around either making what we talked about before, the type-driven development stronger, or making functional programming techniques easier.
Right. Yeah.
And unfortunately, the internals community just doesn't understand the point of functional programming. And I think they're wrong, but we're still working on that.
Yeah.
So asymmetric visibility, which we mentioned before, that Ilya and I worked on, we do want to bring that one up again and see if it has a better chance this time with hooks in place. Maybe we can make the argument better. Still essentially the same thing. We might tweak some bits here and there, but we do want to do that one again. Partial functions, that one would be a challenge. The problem is people like the feature. The implementation that Joe Watkins had for it in the past Um, Nikita felt was too complicated, and a lot of people voted
Right.
with Nikita. And it's doing too many weird things in high traffic places in the code base.
Right.
And if we wanted to do that again, we would need to come up with some very different strategy that doesn't have those problems, which may necessitate some new syntax variant for it to flag it. I am open to that if someone who knows the engine well enough wants to collaborate on that. But until someone wants to work on it, who can actually work on the engine, that's kind of dead. Ilya and I do have two other RFCs that we have partially implemented that are enum related. One is pattern matching, which is an is keyword that lets you, it basically combines all of the type checks into one operator.
Right.
And then lets you also decompose objects at the same time.
Okay.
Which, there's a lot of places where that just makes a bunch of code simpler. It also is a lead-in to algebraic data types, also known as tagged unions, also known as enums with associated values, which is where we really want to get to.
Right, yeah.
Because then instead of having just enums be, hey, it can be A or B, it can be A with this value associated or B with this value associated.
Yeah.
So it kind of, you lose some of the enum capability of the guarantees, but it's like you get certain variants to it. The most common example is a maybe monad. Where it can be either be some with a value or just nothing. Are the options. Also a result monad, which would be lovely to use. But you can also do things like you're writing a game and you have 4 different moves that someone can make.
Right, yeah.
It's turn left, turn right, move forward, X number of spaces, or shoot.
Yeah.
So you can declare an enum with those 4 options, and the move forward option lets you put a number on it.
Right, yeah.
And so that is your entire data model right there in like 8 lines of code.
Yeah. I actually had a use case for tagged unions today, and I was like, "Oh, Larry, we need this."
And one of the ones I would love is I like to use enum values as error sentinels rather than using null, because it provides a richer data set.
Interesting.
But sometimes I want to add a little bit of context to it, just like you would pass a little bit of context to an exception.
Right. Yeah.
And right now you can't. Algebraic data types, tagged unions would let us do that.
Right.
Pattern matching is on the critical path to get there.
Okay.
There are ways you could implement it that don't need pattern matching, but the good ways that most other languages use all dovetail with pattern matching. When we'll be able to get any of these in, open question. We kind of want to do some improvements to the RFC process itself so we don't hate ourselves. So that's in discussion right now.
There's the RFC process. We mentioned it before a bit. There's a question here. How does one get into this vote list of apparently more than like 1,500 people eligible to vote? Let's maybe talk about the RFC process in general and your feelings about it and how it can be improved.
Well, there's lots of ways that we could improve it. The larger question is which ways that we could improve it would actually pass. PHP has a very strong techno-anarchist streak to it culturally. As someone who is not an anarchist with any prefix, this has always bugged me.
Yeah.
The vote list currently is based on who has a certain account on the wiki, or a certain type of account on the wiki, which used to be based on who had version control access to the old CVS server, and then who had access control or access to the SVN server, then who had access to the Git server, and now how it correlates to anything now that we're on GitHub is an open question. It's kind of a mess.
Yeah.
But that means anyone who ever worked on Pair in 2003 still has voting access. Most of them don't use PHP anymore, but they still have voting access. Only about 100 people or so have voted in the last 2 years. But there's a lot of people who will vote on almost every RFC, and there's a lot of people who have voted on 2 or 3 RFCs in the last 2 or 3 years.
Interesting.
Right now, the way you get into the voting list is someone in the voting list who has access to decides to add you. There's really no concrete process more descriptive than that. I got voting access by working on documentation, and at some point I had I'd done enough documentation that someone felt it was worth giving me commit access to the documentation repository, and so now I have a vote as well.
Okay.
And then I think Sarah Goldman gave me commit access to PHP SRC itself, mostly just to troll me. I don't use it, but so it's that process is right now a mess. But every time there's been a proposal to put more structure around that, or reduce the number of people, or allow certain people onto the voting list who haven't committed code or docs to the project, there's a huge outcry of, how dare you take away my vote that I never use, or how dare these other outside people who have never done anything for PHP get a vote, by which we mean project leads of major projects. Like getting Taylor Otwell's opinion on new features is kind of a useful thing, but I don't think he has a vote right now.
No, he doesn't. No.
So, every time that question has come up, it's been a train wreck of a conversation.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a problem. So the RFC process itself, as it stands right now, anyone can ask for a wiki account for the RFC section, and then edit an RFC, make a pull request, post a mailing list message, say, hey, here's a thing, please discuss. And then at least 2 weeks later, they can call a vote. That's the entire process as defined right now.
Yeah.
And what happens in the middle there is just completely undefined. Usually it's loud people on the mailing list talk about it. Whether those loud people correspond to actual consensus opinions is anyone's guess. Right. Sometimes the discussion is almost non-existent. There are RFCs that have been proposed and no one's commented on them for 2 weeks, and they've been put up for vote, and 5 people have voted and it passes.
Right. Yeah.
That's happened a couple of times for simple things. Others, like property hooks, get months of discussion and then go to a vote. Others, like operator overloads, get months of discussion, hundreds of hours of work, and then don't even come close to passing. Yeah. And that really burns out and pisses off contributors, many of whom are, well-meaning, honest, very intelligent, insightful people who screw this. And I freely admit, if property hooks had not passed, I would be in that group myself. And it's like, why am I bothering?
Yeah, I totally get that. I'm super happy that property hooks passed, because it also gives you some motivation, to look at that pile of other RFCs that are interesting. Tagged unions, please. Yeah.
Yeah. There's certainly emotions play a large factor.
No,
on
definitely.
Both sides. Let's just go with that.
Yeah. That makes sense, and I think the fact that everyone's on the internet and there's some kind of filter missing, I guess, and it also adds to the mess. Do you have you've participated in the system for a while now? Do you think there is a solution here, or is it just the way it is? Because as you mentioned, there's this group of people who get to decide how the process goes, because everything has to go through the RFC process, and so it feels like just being stuck in limbo forever.
Yeah, and Ilya and I have been talking with a couple of people about possible improvements we could make to the system. We don't have a concrete, here's what we should do proposal yet. And other people have proposed things in the past. Amongst the proposals that people have made, and this is not in any order, this is kind of ideation, and I'd love to get feedback from you and from the audience on if they have other ideas for how to improve this process. One that seems to have been well received from the people we've talked to is having 2 votes, having similar to how the FIG works. We have an entrance vote that's, do we like the idea? Do we like the idea of property hooks if we did them right? Do we like the idea of operator overloads if we did them right? And if that passes, then you can work on the actual implementation.
Right.
And then have a final vote that approves the final version.
Gotcha.
This at least gives us a sense of it's worth the time to do this work.
Mm.
If the entrance vote fails, with 30% yes, then I know no one actually wants this feature. I won't waste my time.
Yeah,
So that would give some feedback. It's not perfect, but it gives some feedback.
definitely. Yeah.
Anytime this comes up, there are people who propose moving off the mailing list to GitHub, to Discourse, to GitLab, to pick your tool.
Yeah.
That has pros and cons, each of them.
Mm.
Certainly, I mean, mailing lists are 45-year-old technology.
Mm-hmm.
That still somehow works surprisingly well, given that they're 45-year-old technology.
Yeah.
They have a lot of advantages that any forum software doesn't have.
Right.
Yeah. At the same time, they have a lot of drawbacks that forum software or GitHub or whatever have solutions for.
Yeah.
There is no perfect tool at the moment, but could we, like most languages either use Discourse or GitHub for their discussions.
Yeah.
And it's probably a good idea to seriously consider those. And okay, what are the trade-offs for each of those? Are they a good set of trade-offs? There will be trade-offs no matter what.
Definitely, yeah.
But that's a discussion we should have, and not fall back on mailing list is good enough for me, screw y'all.
Right.
Which is what often happens. And I say this as someone who gets along very well with mailing lists. But one of the limitations that affects RFC authors, on GitHub, you can thumbs up someone's comment.
Right.
Get a
Everyone
vague
can
sense
do.
of, okay, get a vague sense of, okay, this person made this comment and 30 people thumbed up the comment. So it means there's probably a lot of people who agree with them. It's not perfect by any means, but that's more signal than we get on the list right now, where if 30 people just responded to someone's comment, say, yeah, me too, we tell them to stop. But that means we don't know who agrees with them or not.
Right.
So that's one of the examples of where there's a trade-off. It's not perfect by any means, but that's the kind of questions we need to be asking.
Yeah.
Another possibility would be we could go full fig and have voters elect a steering committee.
Yeah.
And they are the ones that review and vote on RFCs. So we know these are the 10, 12, 20 people that we need to convince.
Yeah.
And we know they are committing to being involved in the discussion, so we know where they stand on something.
Right.
I suspect the current internals voter pool would despise that idea. Personally, I think it's a good one, but I doubt that would pass just because the techno-anarchist streak. We couldn't even get a technical committee through.
Yeah.
We could do something where only people who vote in the first vote, if we have the split vote, only people who vote in the first vote can vote in the final vote.
Right.
So we kind of opt into a working group for each RFC in this sense. And so these are all just ideas that are getting bounced around. There's probably others to consider. If the audience has suggestions, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, definitely leave them in chat. I can share two thoughts here as well, if that's okay. So I do feel like it's more than a tooling problem. I don't think moving to GitHub will solve everything. I think it will have an impact, especially GitHub or Discourse or whatever. But being able to connect with the community better, and that is a real problem. And I do believe that if people with voting rights have a better understanding of how the community feels about specific things, that might actually influence their vote in a way that it becomes the result becomes more representative of the PHP community. So, but I think there needs to be more than just a tooling switch.
I agree.
Yeah, I wrote about this last year, that personally I very much for these kinds of projects. I think dictatorship is the wrong word, but it's sometimes used in software projects. Not one person per se, but a committee of people who ideally are getting paid to do this. So there is some incentive here that Just people that, I might not always agree with everything they decide, but
Mhm.
I agree with 80 or 90%, and that's fine because that's much better than what's happening right now. I do believe that that's a much better system than what we have. But
What you're describing is representative democracy,
right,
which is what
yeah.
a lot of languages do. They have
Mm,
some kind of elected leadership
yeah.
that is empowered to make decisions, but is responsible for making them intelligently based on feedback from other people. Whereas right now, voters can choose to go look at the Reddit thread if they want.
Yeah.
That's about it in terms of our ability to know, what does the PHP community writ large think about something,
Yeah.
and we
You
don't
know,
actually have a good answer for that.
just as one example, this happened 2 years ago and it really pissed me off. I think I wrote a blog post about some kind of RFC, I can't remember which, and I posted it on Reddit. And in Reddit, someone said, "Oh yeah, that reminds me. Now that I read this blog post, I'll have to go vote as well. Let me just quickly go vote." And I was just like, "Dude, you're like you have this power, this um, privilege to be able to shape a language that
Mhm.
impacts my day-to-day developer life. I don't know, and so many people. And oh yeah, I'll just casually go vote now that you reminded me of it. It's just it's an example, but it really
Yeah,
pissed me off back at the time.
yeah. It's the I said I don't have a techno anarchist streak, and
Mm-hmm.
I find that PHP has survived this long despite that, not because of it, in my view.
Interesting. Yeah, I would agree.
Um, the constant tug of war of what kind of language should PHP be is, I don't think, actually healthy. It's healthy to
Mm.
have that discussion.
Yeah.
It's not healthy to not have an answer to it at any given point in time. The answer is depends who shows up this week.
Right.
And this is an issue I ran into when I was still working on Drupal too, which had a very similar problem of, the decision making by whoever talks the most,
Right. Yeah.
and that's not healthy. I think PHP would benefit from a mission statement, a guiding
Right.
set of
Yeah.
design principles,
Yeah.
which are going to be very different than they would have been 20 years ago. PHP today
Definitely.
is a very different language than it was 20
Yeah.
years ago, and
Yeah.
that's a good thing.
I would
And
agree.
acknowledging that, hey, yeah, PHP is now a typed language.
Mm-hmm.
That's a design decision, and so future design decisions should be built on the idea that we're a typed language now.
Mm.
That making that statement means we could then point back to that and say, hey, in this discussion, we need to keep in mind we're a typed language. We need to be thinking in those terms. So your comments about I hate typed languages is not actually useful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas right now, it's all about who can shout people down.
So here's a question that lingers in my head, and I just want to make clear to everyone watching here that I in no way represent like foundation or anything. This is just me talking, but I wonder, like, wouldn't it be just so much easier if there's a group of people, the foundation or some like another group, I don't know, who just say, okay, let's just start from a clean slate, fork PHP, and just do it the right way. Oh, Roman is here. uh,
Hi, Roman.
Hey, Roman. He speaks for the foundation. I hope you're not. It's okay. Me asking that. I did ask this question to Roman, and he gives a very like balanced answer. I'll ask it to you as well, Larry. Like, why wouldn't that be so much easier to just throw away all the crap? And I'm naive, so it's probably not the right solution. But
So based on other projects that have had that kind of divergence,
right.
the only way that would work is if the PHP project itself did something catastrophically terrible,
Yeah.
and a group of interested parties forked it in self-defense.
Yeah.
Which is what happened with Redis recently.
Yeah.
There's a number of other projects that have gone closed source that have had that. Going way back, who else remembers X386, which turned into Xorg when the project lead tried to change the license?
Mm.
That that's what it would take for people to abandon PHP in favor of PHP or
Right.
PHP
Yeah.
TNG or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But unless you have that kind of, that the project implodes in on itself catastrophically, then Red Hat's not going to switch their default package.
Right.
Ubuntu is not going to switch the default package, which means great, you've got another HHVM, but without Facebook's money.
Yeah.
That's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Okay, so scratch that.
Yeah. I can definitely see the appeal. If I had infinite time and infinite skill, I would absolutely just rewrite the entire thing in Rust and move on with life, and everyone would be happier. But I have neither of those, so here we are.
That's a good way of putting it. There are some nice quotes here from you, Larry. Let me actually see here. Let's not forget this one that we said a little bit earlier on stream.
Oh dear.
Yeah, that's gonna. That's a nice one. Yeah, it's an interesting situation, and meanwhile, there's this meta discussion going on in internals and the politics and all. And meanwhile, there are just thousands and thousands of developers writing PHP and just trying to,
if not millions.
Yeah, millions. Yeah, and yeah, I'm just constantly thinking about what's the best for like the actual users, because in the end, that's what this language is for. So,
and that's also two important points. One, people directing the language, people who are voting, people who are discussing on the mailing list, which is not the same group, need to keep in mind that they're designing a language for 1 million people, not for the dozen people on the list.
Yeah. And
I don't know that we always do that very well. And I'm not going to say that I'm perfect in this regard either. Certainly there's enough griping about getting the balance wrong, about fixing problems in the language versus backward compatibility. That's a regular challenge. And I proposed at one point establishing a release cadence to say, all right, we'll have a 5-year period between majors, because that gives us a place where we can do deprecations and we can plan around that. And people shut it down on the list immediately because no good reason, frankly. I don't remember their reasoning. I just remember disagreeing with it. But that would absolutely be helpful for people maintaining libraries. Like, all right, I know I have X amount of time to fix deprecations before I need to actually worry. At the same time, PHP being so successful means that it's used in a ginormous range of projects. From, there's still people who run, PHP embedded inside HTML with random SQLs stuck in there, and it works for them. It's disgusting, but it works for them.
Yeah.
All the way up through, people building enterprise projects that are, a million-line Symfony project that's running on 50 web heads and serving, 1 billion requests a month, and everything in between. And designing a language that serves that whole range is really, really hard. Trying to retrofit a language to support all of that is even harder. And the fact that PHP has done as well at that as it has, it's not been perfect, but the fact that it's been able to evolve as much as it has, PHP 3 to PHP 8.3 are almost unrecognizable languages. But it's been mostly successful. And, that the project deserves an awful lot of credit for that. PHP and JavaScript are probably the two languages that have evolved the most in their lifetime. And both of them, look at PHP or JavaScript in 2004 compared to 2024. And night and day difference. Those old languages were absolute crap in comparison. And, in both cases, it's been a ton of work by a ton of people to get that far. And we should acknowledge that work that a lot of people have put in, while at the same time saying we still can do a lot better at it, so that we can do that with a lot less pain for all involved. Because, have expecting people to volunteer 300 hours worth of work to maybe not get something achieved is not a good sustainable way to evolve a language that does still need to evolve.
Yeah. Well, okay. We won't like come to any solutions here. I think you share so many great thoughts. What I want to do, if that's okay with you, is just go through a couple more questions that came in while we were talking about property hooks specifically, just to wrap up this section about RFCs in general.
As I said, I love doing Q&A, so
Yeah,
I can answer
exactly.
whatever.
Well, I should share this one as well. Kindly, yeah. It happens. It happens.
I will say there are use cases for that.
Definitely.
I don't think there's a lot of them, but there are absolutely use cases where all I need to do is put 3 lines of dynamic stuff inside this HTML file. And the fact that PHP lets you do that in the same language and engine as you can do, Fortune 100 projects is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
I would not do the Fortune 100 projects this way, but
use the right tool and like patterns and whatever for the job, right? Okay, a couple questions about property hooks still that came in while we're talking. Do hooks work with property promotion?
They do.
They do.
That was a debate of whether they should or not. In the end, we decided yes. Probably the only thing you should do that way is add a set hook to do validation.
Yeah.
If you want to do something more elaborate than that, you probably don't want to use property promotion with it.
Right, but
that much you can do.
What I remember from the RFC, let's say you define a get hook in the interface, and then you have a public property, then that's fine, right?
Yes.
In the concrete class, you don't have to manually define the get hook anymore. It just an empty get hook means the property needs to be accessible from the outside, I guess.
In an interface, you can specify this has to be publicly readable, this has to be publicly writable, or both.
Yeah.
How you achieve that is up to you. That can be via hooks, that can be a read-only property, that can be just a normal bare public property and move on with life.
Yeah.
All of those would satisfy I can write to this and I can read to this or read from this requirements. So we very deliberately designed hooks to be as transparent as possible.
Right.
That was part of the design goal, was to, inserting additional custom logic into the process of writing to a variable is tricky business. And so almost every design decision we had on, so what should this do and what should the behavior be, is based around what's going to make this most transparent and have the least impact on existing code and the least impact on your ability to add features in the future. That's why the RFC is so long, because you had to ferret out, okay, in this case with inheritance doing this complicated thing, what is the transparent thing to do? Okay, we'll do that.
Let me actually, we mentioned the long RFC a couple of times now. Let me quickly scroll through it here, just so that you get a feeling like, I'm scrolling. I'm 25% done now. Still scrolling. I'm gonna scroll a little faster now because it's getting pretty long. But it's been a good thing because the RFC passed. We're arriving at the votes here, with just a super majority, which is great. A couple more questions for people who don't want to read through the whole RFC. I plan on writing a small blog post, as I usually do with like bigger PHP features. So I have to read through the RFC. I already did once, and then it changed. So I'm looking forward to it. Not entirely, but it's okay.
The final version is like the third iteration of the design at this point.
Are hooks overrideable in the child class? Override methods does conflict?
Yes. So we do have a section on inheritance. Again, here the design we went with was essentially, how do we make this behave as much like methods as we can? Right. And that's a good example. There's the first one there. If you can scroll up.
Yeah.
Right there. In this case, we have a class with some public properties on it, nothing particularly interesting, and we have a child class that adds a set hook to one property.
Right.
Just like you could override a method in a child class. So you can think of it as there's an implicit set method and get method that
Right.
the default version of is just a pass through. It doesn't actually work that way, but logically you can think of it like that.
Gotcha.
And then you can override that if you want to. If you want to access the parent hook equivalent, then if you scroll down a little, there's a syntax for that. If you can scroll.
Right.
Yeah, there we go. You have this parent variable set. It looks a bit weird, but you'll get used to it.
Yeah.
We had to use that to avoid an extra 10,000 lines of code.
Okay.
But you're essentially calling a parent method, either the parent set or the parent get method.
Yeah.
And if you think of it like that, everything makes logical sense.
Mm.
And the syntax is just a little bit weird for Lexer reasons.
Yeah, but like you said, we'll get used to it. And if these are like the maybe minor inconveniences for this to work, I mean, I'm fine with that. Like I said, like if I'm totally fine agreeing, like having someone or something represent like 80 or 90% of things I agree with, and if I have to make some I don't know the word, but if I
some compromise.
Thank you. Some compromises, then that's totally fine, because in the end we have property hooks, or at least in PHP 8.4 we'll have them. Okay, a couple more questions here. Now there are 2 hooks, get and set. Are there any plans for more? I think the RFC mentioned.
Yeah, so right now we have no immediate plans to add any more. That said, it is possible to do. We designed it in such a way that you certainly could. Both C# and Swift do have other hooks beyond get and set. Our original version of the RFC actually had 2 other hooks, before set and after set, which is based on Swift.
Yeah.
And we actually got some feedback from the PHP Foundation board, or major investors, before we went public with it. And they said, this is too complicated. And so we simplified it and ended up basically with what Kotlin has. Yeah. So this would not have been able to happen without the foundation. I'll say that out there. The PHP Foundation is a fantastic addition to PHP. So we narrowed it down to just those 2. Yeah. There is nothing stopping us from implementing a isSet or unset hook to override the isSet and unset behavior, like those magic methods. We're not convinced that those are needed, but there's nothing stopping us from adding them later if we decide it's useful to do.
Gotcha.
I believe C# has an init hook, which is used for lazily initializing a property.
Okay.
We could do that. Again, I don't think it's really necessary. The way we have it implemented, you can do the caching yourself easily enough. It might make sense at some point to have a separate validation hook or other syntax. I actually kind of would like to use pattern matching syntax for inline validation in a function definition. I haven't talked to Ilya about that, but I think that'd be wicked cool. But that's still just, Larry has crazy ideas. So yeah, we could add more. Right now, there's no immediate plans to, but it's extensible when we decide it's necessary.
Right. Cool. I have a couple of small questions myself as well to wrap up. So property hooks are coming to PHP 8.4, I think, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. It would be a good thing for people to try them out during beta and release candidate PHP releases, just to get some feedback here. I'll do that as soon as as there's a somewhat a stable release here. But I think everyone who wants to try it out, it would be helpful to get as much feedback from real projects as soon as possible, I would assume.
Yeah, and so these days, Docker actually builds the PHP Docker images. The PHP project does not.
Oh
but
yeah,
they
yeah.
tend to put out Docker images for PHP once it hits beta.
Right.
So please, once it hits beta, with the Docker image, it's very easy to swap in 8.4 beta and see what happens on your project.
Right.
Hooks or I think anything else,
Yeah.
try it and see what happens.
Yeah.
And if you find things that break that are not expected breaks, please report them when we can still fix them.
Gotcha.
If you find things that are slow for some reason, if you find things that you don't understand that we could fix in documentation, in beta, I don't think we do major features in beta, but we can still change things. So
Yeah.
If we've discovered for some reason during like beta 1 that there's some aspect of the hooks design that is just fundamentally broken in some way, I don't think there is, but in theory, then we could still fix that at some point. Might take an extra RFC, might not, depends on what it is, but we could do that. Once it gets to release candidate stage, we're stuck with whatever it is. So the time to start testing your projects on new PHP is beta 1.
Gotcha.
And
we'll have to remember that and mark our calendars and just start doing that and take like responsibility as PHP users as well.
And this goes back to kind of what we were talking about before. The interaction between internals and the broader community is also weaker than it should be. And both parties have a responsibility to address that.
Right.
Internals could do a better job of seeing what the community vibe is on things and voting accordingly. And the community could do a better job of indicating to the internals, hey, this is going to be a problem. Hey, this is a problem. Can we fix it? Earlier than it happens. Like, every release, there's complaints about, there's deprecations and it broke some edge case for me. And those all show up, at around the 0.01 release of something, not at the beta 1 release of something.
Right. Yeah.
When there's nothing we can do about it. Whether we would want to change it or not at that point, we can't. Right. So having that engagement earlier makes it easier to do something about it, or at least ask the question if we want to do something about it.
Yeah, I think that this is a very big takeaway for me personally as well. So thank you for just emphasizing that. And we really need to mark our calendars, and because I love this feature and I wanted to succeed in full from the start that PHP 8.4 is released and not just a couple minor versions later.
Ilya's been banging on it for 2 years. I'm pretty sure the code is rock solid. But
you, Larry, you have no idea what kind of code I write. So
I said Ilya's code is rock solid. I said nothing about yours.
Well, but what kind of edge cases will I discover? I don't know.
Very concrete example there. One of the things we did is PHP has a bunch of different serialization tools built in that do different things in different situations. And we've got serialized, we've got var dump, we've got var export, we've got casting to something to casting an object to an array. In each of these cases, what should hooks do? Do you bypass the hook or not? We came up with the set of guidelines for that we felt was, again, most transparent. It's possible we're wrong. If you're doing something weird and interesting with objects, and you can test it in beta 1 and say, hey, actually, var export should do it the other way around from what it is now. That could actually be better for this reason. If you tell us in beta 1, we can consider that and try fixing it. If you tell us that in 8.4.1, sorry, we're stuck with it. So things like that, where I'm not certain that we got all of those right. Give us that feedback early. The earlier we get that feedback, the easier chance we'll have of changing it if necessary. Or having the discussion and decide we don't want to change it, which is also possible. But
definitely,
the earlier that happens, the better.
We have a responsibility here as well. Like the PHP community, like the user-land developers. Larry, one more question. You did do this on a voluntary basis. Ilya works for the PHP Foundation. I just want to make sure that I take a moment to pitch the right sponsorships or ways that people can help out. I have Let me check here. I have the PHP Foundation website open here. I also found your GitHub sponsor page. I don't know if that's the right place to direct people to.
Yeah, I'd say if you want to support PHP in general and or Ilya, give money to the foundation. If your company makes money off of PHP, please give some of that to the foundation so that you can keep making money with PHP. Definitely. And that's, you know, whether you're working with a framework like Laravel or Symfony, doing it raw PHP, doesn't matter. You know, we all need PHP to be robust and successful, and the foundation is the cornerstone of that now. So give them money. If you want to give me money, I would love it. GitHub sponsors is one way. I would also suggest thanks.dev. Thanks.dev is a site that, I believe that's the correct name. It's another, you know, funding open source approach where you can say, you know, I'm going to fund my project this much, and they figure out, okay, what are your dependencies and all of the libraries that your project depends on, and then it splits the money out to them. So, you know, as an example, if you're using Ben Ramsey's UUID library, you may not even be realizing you're doing it. It's, you know, 6 layers of dependencies deep. But you know that he's still maintaining that. You know, using thanks.dev, you can put in money and it will get split up and eventually get down to the UUID library.
That's very nice.
So I'd say those are the two. If you want to support me, those are the 2 places to do it. Thanks.dev supports a lot of people across projects. Foundation supports their dev team, which is delightful to have. And I will always accept money.
Definitely. I'll make sure to put all those links in the description for people who are watching after the live stream. And I think we're gonna conclude here. There is a lot more things to say, but it's a good time to put this stream to an end. Larry, it was great having you here. I really had a great time talking to you. It's so inspiring, and I just want to thank you. I want to thank everyone in chat as well who was here, who asked questions. It was super insightful. So yeah, and thank you.
I enjoy these too. So happy to come back at some point to talk about whatever the next big new cool thing is.
I'll remember that, and we'll talk soon. Okay, cool. Hey, everyone who's watching, thanks for being here. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And you know what to do down there. And I'll see you in the next video. Okay, bye bye.